Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway of the military base, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Christmas Eve had always been quiet at Fort Henderson, but this year felt different. Most soldiers had gone home for the holidays, leaving only essential personnel behind. The decorated Christmas tree in the lobby seemed lonely, its lights blinking in the darkness. At 52 years old, Maria had been cleaning these same halls for 8 years. She knew every corner, every stain, every creaky floorboard. The soldiers barely noticed her as she emptied trash cans and mopped floors. To them, she was just part of the furniture, invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. But Maria noticed everything. She had grown up in a small village in El Salvador, where her father taught her to read the land, to spot danger before it found you. Those skills had saved her family during the Civil War, helping them escape to America when she was 20. Now, decades later, those same instincts still served her well, even in the quiet corridors of an American military base. As she cleaned the communications room that evening, Maria overheard fragments of worried conversations. Radio chatter spoke of Bravo Battalion, stationed 30 miles northeast in hostile territory. The weather had turned brutal, with heavy snow blocking the mountain roads. Supply convoys couldn't get through, and the battalion was running low on medical supplies and food. Maria continued her work, but her mind wandered to her own son, Miguel, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home with invisible wounds. She understood what it meant for soldiers to be stranded, forgotten, fighting battles that most people would never know about. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, paced the communications room, his face etched with concern. Maria had cleaned his office countless times and had learned to read his expressions. Tonight, he looked more worried than she had ever seen him. The radio crackled with updates from Bravo Battalion. Their situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Sir, the roads are completely impassable," reported Lieutenant Chun, the communications officer. "The engineering corps estimates at least 3 days before they can clear a path through the snow and debris. The battalion is requesting immediate medical evacuation for 2 critically injured soldiers." Colonel Harrison ran his hands through his graying hair. "What about helicopter transport?" "Negative, sir. The weather has grounded all aircraft. Visibility is 0, and the winds are too dangerous for flight operations." Maria emptied the trash can nearby, moving slowly to catch every word. She knew the terrain they were discussing. During her lunch breaks, she often walked the perimeter of the base, studying the maps posted in the briefing rooms. The route to Bravo Battalion's position cut through Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage that had been mined during training exercises years ago. Most of the explosive devices had been cleared, but the area remained dangerous. "There has to be another way," Colonel Harrison muttered. "We can't just leave them out there." Lieutenant Shin pulled up a topographical map on his computer screen. "Sir, there's the old mining trail that runs along the eastern ridge. It's narrow and treacherous, but it might be passable on foot. However, intelligence reports suggest the area may still have active mines from previous training operations." "Absolutely not," the colonel said firmly. "I won't send anyone through that minefield. It would be suicide." Maria finished her work in the communications room and moved on to the next office. But the conversation stayed with her as she cleaned, sorted, and organized. She thought about her son Miguel, about all the young soldiers who had trusted others to bring them home safely. She thought about the 2 critically injured soldiers in Bravo Battalion, fighting for their lives while bureaucracy and weather conspired against them. As the night wore on, the situation only grew worse. The radio reports painted a grim picture. One of the injured soldiers was losing blood fast, and the battalion's medic was running out of supplies to keep him stable. Time was running out. Maria had seen enough war to know what happened when good people did nothing. She had learned from her father that sometimes the most dangerous thing was not the action you took, but the action you failed to take. As she finished her rounds and prepared to leave for the night, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She walked to the supply depot, using her master key to enter the building. Her years of faithful service had earned her access to areas most civilians never saw. She gathered what she could carry: medical supplies, emergency rations, water purification tablets, and a basic first aid kit. Everything fit into her large cleaning bag, the same one she used to collect trash every day. Maria also took something else, a detailed map of the mining trail and surrounding area, carefully folded and tucked into her jacket pocket. She had studied these maps during her breaks, memorizing the terrain with the same intensity she had once used to navigate the dangerous mountains of her homeland. Before leaving the base, Maria stopped by the small chapel and lit a candle. She whispered a prayer for the soldiers of Bravo Battalion, for their families waiting at home, and for the strength to do what needed to be done. The flame flickered in the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the walls. As she walked toward the main gate, Maria passed the security checkpoint where Sergeant Miller was on duty. He barely looked up from his paperwork as she showed her identification card. "Working late tonight, Maria?" he asked absently. "Just finishing up," she replied in her accented English. "Merry Christmas, Sergeant." "Merry Christmas to you too." She stepped out into the cold night air, her breath forming clouds in the frigid darkness. Snow was still falling, and the wind howled through the trees. Most people would consider the weather a barrier, an insurmountable obstacle. But Maria had walked through worse conditions to escape death squads in El Salvador. She had crossed deserts and mountains to reach safety. This was just another journey. Maria looked back at the base one last time, its lights warm and welcoming in the distance. Then, she turned toward the dark mountains, shouldered her bag of supplies, and began walking into the night. Behind her, the radio in the communications room continued its desperate chatter, searching for solutions that seemed impossible to find. But Maria Santos, the invisible janitor, had already become part of the solution. She was walking toward Devil's Canyon, toward a minefield that had stopped trained soldiers, carrying nothing but medical supplies and a lifetime of quiet courage. The fate of 37 soldiers now rested in the hands of a woman most people had never bothered to notice. The first 3 miles were the easiest. Maria followed the main road that led away from Fort Henderson, her flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. The bag on her shoulder grew heavier with each step, but she had carried heavier loads before. During the war in El Salvador, she had once walked 15 miles through mountain passes carrying her infant daughter and enough supplies to keep her family alive for a week. When the paved road ended, Maria pulled out the map she had taken from the base. The mining trail began here, marked with faded warning signs about unexploded ordnance. Most of the signs were in English, but the universal symbol of a skull and crossbones needed no translation. Maria studied the map carefully, using her flashlight to trace the route she needed to take. The trail itself was barely visible under the fresh snow, just a slightly wider gap between the trees that wound its way up the mountainside. Maria had to rely on her knowledge of the terrain and the occasional trail marker to stay on the correct path. She moved carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight down. As she climbed higher, the temperature dropped and the wind grew stronger. Ice formed on her glasses, forcing her to stop frequently to wipe them clean. Her hands were already numb despite her gloves, but she pressed on. Somewhere ahead, soldiers were counting on someone to help them. They just didn't know that someone was a 52-year-old janitor with arthritic knees and 20-year-old boots. 2 hours into her journey, Maria reached the first really dangerous section. According to the map, this area had been used for mine detection training 5 years earlier. Military engineers had removed most of the devices, but the keyword was most. Intelligence reports suggested that several mines might still be active, buried under years of fallen leaves and now covered by snow. Maria stopped at the edge of the suspected minefield and pulled out her flashlight. She swept the beam slowly across the ground, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Her father had taught her to read the earth like a book, to spot disturbances that others might miss. During the Civil War, this skill had helped her family avoid rebel camps and government patrols. Now she was using it to detect buried explosives. The snow made everything more difficult. What might normally be a slight depression or raised area was hidden under a blanket of white. Maria had to rely on other signs. The way the snow settled differently over disturbed ground, the absence of small bushes or saplings in certain areas, the subtle changes in the natural drainage patterns. She found her first mine 20 feet into the field. The snow had settled differently over a circular area about the size of a dinner plate. Maria marked the spot with a piece of torn fabric from her cleaning rag, tying it to a nearby branch. Then, she carefully backed away and chose a different path. The process was painstakingly slow. Step by step, Maria worked her way across the minefield, probing gently with a broken tree branch before putting her weight on each foot. She found 2 more mines, marking each one carefully. The cold was becoming a serious problem now. Her fingers were so numb that she could barely grip her flashlight, and ice was forming on her eyebrows and inside her nose. But Maria had been cold before. She remembered winters in the mountains of El Salvador, when her family had hidden in caves to escape the violence. Her mother had taught her to generate warmth through movement and breathing exercises. As she navigated the minefield, Maria used these techniques to keep her core temperature stable. Halfway through the dangerous section, disaster struck. Maria's foot caught on a hidden root, and she stumbled forward. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might fall face first onto an unexploded mine. She managed to catch herself against a tree, but the sudden movement had jarred something loose. Behind her, she heard a soft clicking sound. Maria froze. She knew that sound from stories her father had told about the Civil War. It was the sound of a pressure-activated trigger being released. Somewhere behind her, a mine had been disturbed. She held her breath, waiting for an explosion that would end her mission and her life. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. The device must have been a dud, or perhaps it was just a training mine that had been deactivated years ago. Maria said a silent prayer of gratitude and continued forward, even more careful than before. It took her nearly 2 hours to cross the minefield. When she finally reached safe ground on the other side, Maria allowed herself a brief rest. She checked her map and calculated the distance remaining. She was making good time despite the dangerous terrain, but the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. The trail now led down into Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge that twisted between towering rock walls. During training exercises, this area was known for its unpredictable weather patterns and loose rock that could trigger avalanches. But it was also the only route that would get her close to Bravo Battalion's position. As Maria descended into the canyon, the wind became a constant, howling presence. It funneled between the rock walls with tremendous force, sometimes threatening to knock her off her feet. Snow swirled in crazy patterns, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The trail was treacherous here, carved into the side of the cliff with no guardrails or safety barriers. In some places, it was barely wide enough for one person. Maria had to press herself against the rock wall as she inched forward, her bag scraping against the stone. 3 hours after entering Devil's Canyon, Maria encountered her most serious obstacle yet. A recent rock slide had partially blocked the trail, leaving only a narrow gap between fallen boulders and the canyon wall. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and loose rocks threatened to complete the blockage at any moment. Maria studied the situation carefully. She could try to climb over the pile of rocks, but that would expose her to the risk of triggering another slide. She could attempt to find an alternate route, but that would add hours to her journey, time that the injured soldiers might not have. Instead, she chose the most direct approach. Maria removed her heavy bag and pushed it through the narrow gap first. Then, she squeezed through herself, scraping her jacket and tearing her pants in the process. As she pulled her bag through the other side, several more rocks tumbled down, sealing the passage behind her. There was no turning back now. Maria was committed to the journey ahead, whatever it might bring. She continued down the canyon trail, fighting exhaustion and the brutal cold. Her water bottles had frozen solid, and she had to stop periodically to break ice out of the caps. The medical supplies in her bag were probably freezing too, but she hoped they would still be effective once warmed up. As dawn began to break over the mountains, Maria could see the far end of Devil's Canyon ahead. According to her map, Bravo Battalion's position was just 2 miles beyond that point. She had been walking for 8 hours straight, crossing terrain that military engineers had deemed impassable. Her legs ached, her shoulders burned from carrying the heavy bag, and she could no longer feel her toes. But she was almost there. Somewhere ahead, 37 soldiers were waiting for help that they didn't even know was coming. Maria Santos, the invisible janitor, was about to become the most important person in their world. As she emerged from Devil's Canyon into the gray light of Christmas morning, Maria could see smoke rising in the distance. That had to be Bravo Battalion's camp. She was so close now that she could almost smell the wood fires they were burning to stay warm. But between Maria and the soldiers lay one final challenge, an open stretch of terrain that intelligence reports indicated might be under enemy observation. If hostile forces were monitoring the area, a lone figure crossing that ground would be an easy target. Maria looked at the brightening sky and made her final calculation. She had come too far to stop now. Those soldiers needed the medical supplies she was carrying, and she was the only person who could deliver them. She shouldered her bag one more time and began the last phase of her impossible journey. The open ground stretched before Maria like a frozen wasteland. 2 miles of snow-covered terrain separated her from Bravo Battalion's position, with no trees or rocks to provide cover. Intelligence reports had warned of possible enemy observation posts in the surrounding hills, which meant that crossing during daylight would be extremely dangerous. But Maria had no choice. The radio chatter she had overheard at the base indicated that one of the injured soldiers was in critical condition. Every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death. She pulled her dark jacket tighter around her body and began moving across the exposed ground, staying low and trying to present as small a target as possible. The snow was deeper here, sometimes reaching up to her knees. Each step required tremendous effort, and the heavy bag on her shoulder made balance difficult. Maria had to stop frequently to catch her breath, but she never stopped moving forward. Her father had taught her that the key to survival was persistence, not speed, not strength, but the simple refusal to give up. As she struggled through the deep snow, Maria's mind wandered to her son Miguel. He had been about the same age as many of the soldiers in Bravo Battalion when he deployed to Afghanistan. She remembered the phone calls home, his voice trying to sound cheerful while she could hear the exhaustion and fear underneath. She remembered the nightmares that started after he came back, the way he would wake up screaming about friends who hadn't made it home. Those memories drove her forward now. Every soldier in that stranded battalion was someone's son or daughter, someone's hope and pride and joy. Their families were probably gathered around Christmas trees this morning, trying to celebrate while worrying about their loved ones serving in dangerous places. Maria understood that worry, that helpless feeling of being unable to protect the people you loved most. Halfway across the open ground, Maria heard something that made her blood run cold, the distant sound of helicopters. She looked up and saw 2 aircraft approaching from the north, flying low and fast. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Perhaps these were rescue helicopters coming to evacuate the injured soldiers. But as the aircraft came closer, Maria realized they weren't American helicopters. The silhouettes were wrong, and they were approaching from the direction of known hostile territory. These were enemy aircraft, probably conducting reconnaissance or preparing for an attack on Bravo Battalion. Maria threw herself down into the snow, pressing her body as flat as possible against the ground. The helicopters passed overhead, their rotor wash creating a whirlwind of snow and ice. She could see the faces of the crew members through the aircraft windows, scanning the ground below for any signs of movement. The helicopters circled the area twice before heading toward Bravo Battalion's position. Maria realized with growing horror that they were conducting surveillance for an attack. The stranded American soldiers weren't just isolated and running low on supplies. They were about to face an assault from a superior enemy force. This changed everything. Maria was no longer just carrying medical supplies to help injured soldiers. She was carrying intelligence that could save the entire battalion from annihilation. She had to reach them before the enemy attack began. Maria pushed herself up from the snow and began running. Her body protested every step. Her lungs burned in the cold air, her legs trembled with exhaustion, and the heavy bag bounced painfully against her hip. But she forced herself to keep moving, driven by the knowledge that 37 lives hung in the balance. As she crested a small hill, Maria finally caught sight of Bravo Battalion's camp. It was smaller than she had expected, just a collection of tents and temporary structures clustered around several burned-out vehicles. Smoke rose from small fires where soldiers were trying to stay warm. She could see figures moving around the camp, but even from a distance, it was clear that morale was low and resources were running short. The camp was positioned in a small valley, surrounded by hills on three sides. It was a defensible position against ground attack, but it would be vulnerable to assault from the air or from the high ground. Maria realized that the enemy helicopters had probably identified the same tactical situation. She was less than a mile from the camp now, but the final approach would be the most dangerous part of her journey. The ground sloped downward toward the valley, providing little cover. If enemy forces were indeed preparing an attack, they would almost certainly have scouts positioned on the surrounding hills. Maria decided to take a calculated risk. Instead of trying to sneak into the camp undetected, she would approach directly and hope that American sentries would see her before any enemy observers did. She pulled out a small mirror from her first aid kit and began flashing signals toward the camp, using the reflection of the morning sun to attract attention. It worked. Within minutes, she could see soldiers moving with more purpose around the camp perimeter. Someone had spotted her signals and was organizing a response. Maria waved her arms above her head and began shouting, even though she knew her voice wouldn't carry across the distance. Two soldiers emerged from the camp and began moving in her direction, weapons ready but not raised. They approached cautiously, probably confused about why a middle-aged woman was wandering around a combat zone carrying what appeared to be a cleaning bag. The first soldier to reach her was a young sergeant named Rodriguez. His face was drawn with exhaustion, and his uniform showed the wear of several days in the field without resupply. He looked at Maria with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military area," Rodriguez said. "How did you get here? Where did you come from?" Maria was breathing heavily from her run across the open ground, but she managed to get the essential information out between gasps. "Fort Henderson, medical supplies, enemy helicopters, attack coming." Rodriguez's expression changed immediately. He grabbed his radio and called back to the camp. "Base camp, this is Rodriguez. I have a civilian woman here claiming to be from Fort Henderson with medical supplies. She's also reporting enemy air activity. Request immediate debrief." The response came back quickly. "Bring her in immediately. CO wants to talk to her now." Rodriguez and his partner, a private named Johnson, escorted Maria toward the camp. As they walked, she explained her journey in more detail. The overheard radio conversation, her decision to cross the minefield, the enemy helicopters she had seen. The soldiers listened with growing amazement and alarm. "Lady, you're telling me you walked through Devil's Canyon in a blizzard?" Johnson asked incredulously. "And crossed the mine training area? That's impossible." "Not impossible," Maria replied quietly. "Just very dangerous." As they approached the camp perimeter, Maria could see the full extent of Bravo Battalion's predicament. Several vehicles had been damaged by improvised explosive devices, leaving the unit without transportation. Their communication equipment had been partially destroyed in the same attacks, which explained why Fort Henderson had received only intermittent reports about their situation. The soldiers themselves looked exhausted and demoralized. They had been stranded for 4 days without resupply, fighting off periodic attacks while caring for their wounded comrades. Many of them had minor injuries that hadn't been properly treated due to lack of medical supplies. But when word spread through the camp that a woman had walked through impossible terrain to bring them help, something changed in the soldiers' demeanor. Maria could see it in their faces, a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and renewed hope. If someone cared enough about them to risk everything for their rescue, then perhaps they weren't as forgotten as they had begun to believe. The camp's commanding officer, Captain Williams, emerged from the command tent to meet them. He was a career soldier in his late 30s, with the weathered face of someone who had seen multiple deployments. Like his men, he looked exhausted and concerned, but his eyes sharpened when he saw Maria and heard Rodriguez's preliminary report. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Williams," he said, extending his hand. "I understand you've brought medical supplies from Fort Henderson. How in God's name did you get here?" Maria shook his hand and looked into his eyes. She saw the doubt there, the skepticism that a middle-aged janitor could have accomplished what trained soldiers considered impossible. But she also saw hope and desperation and the weight of responsibility for 37 lives. "Captain," she said simply, "I walked. And we need to talk about those helicopters I saw. I think your men are in more danger than they realize." Inside the command tent, Captain Williams spread a tactical map across a folding table while Maria described everything she had observed during her journey. The warmth of the tent was a shocking contrast to the hours she had spent in the freezing wilderness, but she forced herself to focus on the crucial information she needed to convey. "The helicopters came from the northeast," Maria said, pointing to the map with a steady finger despite her exhaustion. "Two of them, flying in formation. They circled this area twice before heading toward your position. They were definitely conducting reconnaissance." Captain Williams exchanged concerned looks with his senior sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Masters. "How long ago was this?" Williams asked. "Maybe 40 minutes, Maria replied. "I started running after I saw them because I knew it meant trouble." Sergeant Masters leaned over the map, studying the terrain features. "If they were scouting for an attack, they'd probably set up observation posts here and here," he said, marking 2 hills that overlooked the valley. "Those positions would give them clear fields of fire into our camp." Williams nodded grimly. "How many men do we have who are combat effective?" 28, sir," Masters replied. "The other 9 are either wounded or too sick to fight effectively. And we're running critically low on ammunition." Maria listened to their tactical discussion while unpacking the medical supplies she had carried through the mountains. She had brought everything she could find at the base: antibiotics, pain medication, bandages, surgical supplies, and emergency field dressings. It wasn't enough to fully resupply a battalion medical unit, but it would help stabilize the wounded soldiers and treat the minor injuries that had been accumulating over 4 days without proper care. "Ma'am," Captain Williams said, turning his attention back to Maria, "I have to ask you something that might sound strange. During your journey here, did you see any evidence of enemy ground forces? Tracks, equipment, anything that might indicate they have troops in the area?" Maria thought carefully before answering. Her years of experience in El Salvador had taught her to observe details that might seem insignificant to others. "I saw snowmobile tracks crossing the trail about 3 miles back," she said. "Fresh tracks, maybe from this morning. And there were cigarette butts near one of the rest areas, foreign brand, not American." The 2 soldiers exchanged another look. "How do you know it was a foreign brand?" Masters asked. "My late husband smoked," Maria explained. "I learned to recognize different cigarette types from cleaning ashtrays for 8 years. These had Cyrillic writing on the filters." This intelligence painted a troubling picture. Enemy forces weren't just conducting aerial surveillance. They had ground scouts in the area as well. Captain Williams realized that his battalion wasn't just stranded and undersupplied. They were surrounded. "Sergeant Masters, I want you to quietly position our best marksmen on the perimeter," Williams ordered. "Tell them to watch for movement on the ridge lines, but don't do anything to reveal our defensive positions. If the enemy thinks we're unaware of their presence, that gives us a small advantage." As Masters left to organize the defenses, Williams turned back to Maria. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to do something that might be even more dangerous than your journey here. We need to get word back to Fort Henderson about our situation. Our long-range radio was damaged in yesterday's attack, and we can only communicate on short-range frequencies." Maria understood what he was asking. Someone needed to make the return journey through Devil's Canyon and across the Minefield, carrying intelligence about the enemy forces and Bravo Battalion's desperate need for reinforcement. The obvious choice was Maria herself. She was the only person who had successfully navigated the route. "Captain," Maria said quietly, "I'm 52 years old, and I just walked 14 miles through terrain that your own engineers called impossible. I don't know if I have another journey like that left in me." Williams nodded with understanding. "I wouldn't ask if there was any other option, but you've proven that the route is passable, and you know the locations of the mines you marked. No one else has that knowledge." Before Maria could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of gunfire from the camp perimeter. Masters' voice crackled over the radio. "Contact! Snipers on the eastern ridge, taking fire from multiple positions." The attack had begun sooner than anyone expected. Through the tent walls, Maria could hear the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper boom of larger weapons. Soldiers were shouting orders, and calling for ammunition. The sound of combat was something Maria remembered from her childhood in El Salvador, and it brought back memories she had spent decades trying to forget. Captain Williams grabbed his rifle and radio. "I have to go coordinate our defense," he told Maria. "But I need an answer about that mission back to Fort Henderson. If we don't get reinforcements soon, none of us are going home for New Year's." Maria looked through the tent flap at the chaos outside. Soldiers were running to defensive positions while medics worked frantically to move the wounded to more protected locations. These young men and women were fighting for their lives, outnumbered and outgunned, with nowhere to retreat. She thought about her son Miguel again, about all the times he had relied on others to watch his back and bring him home safely. She thought about the families of these soldiers, probably sitting around Christmas breakfast tables at this very moment, unaware that their loved ones were fighting a desperate battle in a frozen valley halfway around the world. "Captain," Maria called out as Williams prepared to leave the tent. "Give me 5 minutes to rest, and I'll carry your message back to Fort Henderson." Williams paused at the tent entrance, his face showing both relief and admiration. "Maria, you're the bravest person I've ever met. But I have to tell you, the enemy knows someone made it through their perimeter. They'll be watching that route now. The return journey will be even more dangerous than getting here. Then, we better hope I'm as good at hiding as I am at walking," Maria replied with a tired smile. As Williams rushed out to join the battle, Maria quickly organized her remaining supplies. She kept the most critical medical items for the battalion's medics, but packed emergency rations and water purification tablets for her return journey. She also wrote a detailed note about the enemy forces she had observed, including their approximate positions and the direction of their approach routes. The sound of gunfire was intensifying outside. Maria could hear the distinctive whistle of mortar rounds landing nearby, shaking the tent with each explosion. The enemy assault was more organized and aggressive than a simple probing attack. This was a serious attempt to overrun Bravo Battalion's position. Maria sealed Captain Williams' written message in a plastic bag and tucked it inside her jacket. The message contained crucial intelligence about the enemy's strength and positions, along with an urgent request for immediate air support and reinforcement. Getting that information to Fort Henderson could mean the difference between rescue and annihilation for the 37 soldiers of Bravo Battalion. As she prepared to leave the relative safety of the command tent, Maria said a quick prayer for the soldiers around her. Some of them were barely older than her son had been during his first deployment. They deserved someone fighting for them, someone willing to risk everything to bring them home. Maria Santos, the invisible janitor who had spent 8 years emptying trash cans and mopping floors, was about to undertake the most important mission of her life. But this time, she wouldn't be walking into unknown danger. This time, she would be walking back through territory that was almost certainly crawling with enemy forces who knew she was coming. The return journey would test every survival skill she had learned during the war in El Salvador, every lesson her father had taught her about reading the land and avoiding danger. But failure wasn't an option. Too many lives were depending on her success. As Maria stepped out of the tent into the chaos of combat, she caught sight of Captain Williams directing his soldiers' defensive fire. He saw her preparing to leave and gave her a brief salute, a gesture of respect from a career military officer to a civilian who had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances. Maria returned the salute with a nod, shouldered her lightened pack, and began walking toward the edge of camp. Behind her, the battle for Bravo Battalion's survival was just beginning. Ahead of her lay 14 miles of hostile territory and the most dangerous journey of her life. Maria moved away from Bravo Battalion's camp as quietly as possible, staying low and using every piece of available cover. The sound of gunfire behind her was growing more intense, which meant the enemy attack was escalating. She had to get Captain Williams' message back to Fort Henderson before the battalion was completely overrun. The return journey presented challenges she hadn't faced during her approach. The enemy now knew that someone had penetrated their surveillance perimeter, which meant they would be actively hunting for her. The tracks she had made in the snow during her inbound journey would also make her easier to follow. Maria decided to take a different route back, one that would be more difficult but less predictable. Instead of retracing her exact path, She would circle around to the north, adding distance, but hopefully avoiding the enemy patrols that were probably watching her original trail. The new route took her through steeper terrain, where the snow was deeper and the footing more treacherous. But Maria's childhood in the mountains of El Salvador had prepared her for this kind of travel. She knew how to read the slope of the land, how to find the most stable footing, and how to move efficiently even in difficult conditions. 2 hours into her return journey, Maria encountered her first serious obstacle. As she crested a ridge, she spotted 2 enemy soldiers positioned in a small clearing below. They were armed with rifles and had a clear view of the main trail she would have used if she had taken her original route. The men were scanning the area methodically, obviously looking for anyone trying to escape from the battlefield. Maria dropped down behind a fallen tree and studied the situation. The soldiers were positioned too well to avoid completely, but they seemed focused on the main trail rather than the more difficult terrain to the north. If she could work her way around their position without being seen, she might be able to continue her journey undetected. She began a careful flanking movement, crawling through the snow on her belly to stay below the sight line of the enemy soldiers. The cold was brutal. Ice formed on her jacket, and snow worked its way inside her clothes. But she had done this before, during the Civil War in El Salvador, when being spotted by the wrong people meant death for her entire family. It took her nearly an hour to circle around the enemy position, moving just a few feet at a time. When she finally reached cover on the far side of the clearing, Maria looked back and could still see the 2 soldiers maintaining their vigil. They had no idea she had passed within 50 yards of their position. But the detour had cost her precious time. The gunfire behind her was becoming more sporadic, which could mean that Bravo Battalion was running out of ammunition. If the enemy overran their position before help arrived, her mission would become pointless. Every minute of delay potentially sealed the fate of 37 soldiers. Maria pushed herself harder, ignoring the burning in her lungs and the ache in her legs. She was approaching the entrance to Devil's Canyon now, where the real challenges would begin. The narrow trail through the gorge had been difficult enough during her approach, but now she would be traveling uphill against gravity and exhaustion. As she entered the canyon, Maria realized that the wind patterns had shifted. The howling gusts that had made her approach so treacherous were now working in her favor, masking the sound of her movement and making it harder for anyone to track her by sound. She used this advantage to move more quickly through the most exposed sections of the trail. But speed came with increased risk. In her haste to make up lost time, Maria's foot slipped on a patch of ice. She caught herself before falling, but the sudden movement dislodged several rocks that tumbled down the canyon wall. The sound echoed off the stone walls like a series of gunshots. Maria froze, listening for any indication that the noise had attracted attention. For several tense minutes, she heard nothing but the wind howling through the canyon. But then, from somewhere behind her, came the distant sound of voices calling to each other in a foreign language. The enemy had heard the falling rocks and were investigating. She had to move faster now. Maria abandoned some of her caution and began moving through the canyon at a pace that bordered on reckless. She leaped over gaps in the trail, slid down steep sections, and used her hands to scramble up rock faces when the path became too narrow to walk normally. The voices behind her were getting closer. Maria realized that the enemy forces included experienced mountain troops who could move through difficult terrain almost as well as she could. Her head start was diminishing rapidly. 3 hours after leaving Bravo Battalion, Maria emerged from Devil's Canyon and faced the minefield she had crossed during her approach. This time, however, she had an advantage: the cloth markers she had tied to branches to indicate the locations of active mines. If those markers were still in place, she could navigate the dangerous area much more quickly. The first marker was exactly where she had left it, a small piece of fabric tied to a low branch. Maria felt a surge of hope. She moved from marker to marker, following the safe path she had identified during her inbound journey. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. The enemy forces had definitely picked up her trail. Halfway through the minefield, disaster struck again. One of her markers was missing, probably blown away by the wind or knocked down by an animal. Maria found herself standing at the edge of a cleared area with no indication of where the safe path continued. She could hear voices at the entrance to the minefield now. The enemy soldiers were less than 10 minutes behind her, and they would probably have mine detectors or other equipment that would allow them to move through the area faster than she could. Maria made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to carefully probe for mines, she would use her knowledge of the terrain to identify the most likely safe route. During her approach, she had noticed that the mines seemed to be concentrated in areas where soldiers would naturally seek cover or concealment. The most direct path across open ground was probably the safest, even though it felt counterintuitive. She ran. Maria sprinted across the suspected mine field, her heart pounding with the knowledge that each step could be her last. Behind her, she could hear shouts as the enemy soldiers spotted her movement. A rifle shot cracked through the air, and she felt the bullet whistle past her head. More shots followed, but Maria kept running. The enemy soldiers were too far away for accurate fire, and they were probably reluctant to use automatic weapons in a minefield where ricochets could trigger explosions. She reached the far edge of the dangerous area and dove behind a large boulder just as several more bullets chipped fragments from the rock above her head. The enemy forces had stopped at the edge of the minefield. Maria could hear them arguing about whether to follow her through the dangerous area. Their voices were animated and frustrated. They knew their quarry was escaping, but they also knew that pursuing her through unmarked mines would be extremely risky. While they debated, Maria kept moving. She was now on the final stretch of her journey, the 3 miles of main road that led back to Fort Henderson. The familiar terrain gave her renewed energy, and she began jogging despite her exhaustion. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, Maria finally saw the gates of Fort Henderson ahead. The base looked exactly the same as when she had left it 12 hours earlier, but she felt like a different person. The invisible janitor who had walked out into the night had become someone who had accomplished the impossible. At the main gate, Sergeant Miller looked up from his paperwork with the same bored expression he had worn the night before. But his demeanor changed quickly when he saw Maria's condition. Her torn clothes, her exhausted face, the urgent intensity in her eyes. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, standing up from his desk. "You look like you've been in some kind of accident." "I need to see Colonel Harrison immediately," Maria said, pulling Captain Williams' message from her jacket. "Bravo Battalion is under attack, and they need help right now." Sergeant Miller's training kicked in. He immediately called the communications center while escorting Maria toward the main building. Within minutes, Colonel Harrison appeared, still wearing his Christmas morning casual uniform, but with a face that showed he understood the gravity of the situation. "Maria," he said with disbelief, "what are you doing here? How did you get back on base?" She handed him Captain Williams' message and gave him a brief summary of everything she had observed. As Colonel Harrison read the detailed intelligence report, his expression became increasingly serious. He immediately called for his senior staff to assemble in the communications center. "Get me the Air Force Base," he ordered Lieutenant Chun. "I need immediate close air support at these coordinates. And contact Division Headquarters. We need a helicopter assault team here within 2 hours." The response was swift and decisive. Within 30 minutes of Maria's arrival, fighter jets were screaming overhead toward Bravo Battalion's position. An hour later, helicopter gunships followed, along with a full rescue and reinforcement team. The radio reports that came back confirmed that Maria's intelligence had been accurate, and her timing had been critical. Bravo Battalion had been on the verge of being overrun when the air support arrived. The enemy forces were dispersed, and the wounded soldiers were evacuated to proper medical facilities. All 37 members of Bravo Battalion survived the Christmas Day battle, including the 2 critically injured soldiers whose condition had originally prompted Maria's impossible journey. The medical supplies she had carried through the mountains had stabilized them long enough for professional evacuation teams to arrive. Later that evening, as Maria sat in Colonel Harrison's office giving her detailed after-action report, the base commander looked at her with an expression of awe and respect. "Maria," he said quietly, "in 30 years of military service, I have never seen anything like what you accomplished today. You single-handedly saved the lives of an entire battalion. How do you feel about that?" Maria was quiet for a moment, thinking about her son Miguel, about all the soldiers who had come home safely because someone had cared enough to help them. She thought about the families who would have Christmas dinners with their loved ones this year because of what had happened. "Colonel," she said finally, "I just did what needed to be done. Those soldiers are somebody's children. They deserved someone fighting for them." 3 months later, Maria Santos received the Medal of Freedom from the President of the United States in a ceremony at the White House. She was the first civilian janitor in American history to receive the nation's highest honor for civilian service. But on that Christmas evening, as she finally went home to her small apartment near the base, Maria Santos was still just a janitor who had proven that heroism comes in all forms, and that sometimes the most important missions are carried out by the people others never notice. The 37 soldiers of Bravo Battalion never forgot the woman who walked through a minefield on Christmas Eve to save their lives. Neither did their families, or their children, or anyone who heard the story of how an invisible janitor became the most visible hero of Christmas Day.